So welcome back, everybody. We just entered into the second section, and I'm glad to introduce then, again, through Ana Rosa, our next lecturer, but just a practical detail. Since we have the online participants also, we just checked that everything going fine with the YouTube joiners, and we would like to enhance the question and answer section as well, so don't hesitate to raise your hand, those who are here in person, and for all those who join us online, just a gentle reminder that there has been a certain update in terms of schedule due to an unforeseen health issue regarding one of our lecturers. Unfortunately, from Sissinghurst, they cannot join us now for personal healthy matters, and they are very sorry for this. So Troy, Scott Smith cannot join us at this moment, so that's why you can see already that our next lecturer will be someone else. However, we didn't want it to bother any of the further lecturers, so we didn't change the order. This is quite a prompt matter. So for this reason, we had to advance the program. So we will have now 2 lecturers, and then we will have the question and answer section also regarding the first part. So don't hesitate to note your questions. And for all those who join us through the online streaming, there is an email address that has just been resent to you with all the instructions, thanks to our technical team who are doing an amazing job and responding to all the expectations, the prompt ones as well. So thanks for all. And you can send not your questions, but just an email. But there are all the instructions, and it will start at 11:20, 25 around-ish, so don't hesitate to share it through this way. And all those who are present, you can just raise your hands. But first and foremost, there are the further lectures. So Ana Rosa, would you be so kind to introduce our lecturers?
So, we give the floor now to our friends and partners from the National Museum in Warsaw, the branch of the museum in Nieborov and Arcadia. They are here for the first time. Welcome, we're very glad to have you. And it's Katarzyna Sak-Satorska, head of garden department, the one that is going to give us the lecture, Literary Arcadia in Garden Inscriptions. Welcome, the floor is yours.
Thank you for your invitation. I'm very happy to be here. Literary Arcadia, garden inscriptions. Arcadia, Greek mythical land at the Peloponnese, considered by the poets to be the land of happiness. It was an idealized symbol of the land of peace, harmony, and eternal Eden. It was considered to be the land of poetry and art. In line with the theme of the 5th annual Forum of Historical Gardens, Literature and Historical Gardens, the literary theme of the Arcadian motif and the Arcadian myth, popularized by the Roman poet Virgil, was reflected in the work of Duchess Helena Radziwiłł, The Garden of Arcadia. The garden called Arcadia in Polish is located in central Poland, 70 kilometers west of Warsaw. It was built at the end of the 18th century. The Duchess was an educated, well-read person who knew an ancient culture, literature, and poetry. This knowledge had a huge impact on the shape of the garden in Arcadia. She was fluent in French and German, as well as English and Italian, committing herself to reading of poetry and European literature. The starting point of my presentation, Literary Arcadia Garden Inscriptions, is the literary work of Duchess Helena Radziwiłł and numerous garden inscriptions hidden among the greenery. You can try to recreate the gardens program by following the trail of Le Guide d'Arcadie Garden Guide, written by Helena Radziwiłł, published in 1800 in Berlin, only in 100 copies. The Duchess, while reading the 5-page guide in French, wanted to popularize the Garden Arcadia, mapping out the sightseeing routes, but without explaining the details. The guide to the garden showed the individual garden places, and the arrangement was used to prepare the framing of my presentation. Duchess Helena Radziwiłł introduced rich and original content to the park, which is combination with its individual fragments were marked with sentimental and romantic nomenclature. The Baucis and Philemon's huts, the Sibyl's grotto with a hermit's hut, the stone arch, the Gothic house, the Diana's temple, the big pond with island of offerings, the aqueduct, the high priest's sanctuary and Margrave house, the tomb of the Poplar Island and Elysian fields on the Tomb of Illusions, and the circus. The Arcadia Garden, following the example of English and French gardens, had a rich ideological program and philosophical program based on mythological and literary association and the iconography of Masonic rituals. From the beginning, the garden was dominated by the symbolism of meanings and coded in composition of architectural assumptions, also in small garden forms, in sentences placed on buildings, boards and boulders, even in the planting of greenery and flowers. Garden inscriptions were a characteristic motif on landscape sentimental gardens of 18th century. The inscriptions appeared of stones, monuments cratered among the trees, as well as on the facade of buildings, garden elements, sarcophagi, urns, and orthos. The inscriptions were devoted to people or events, glorified the victories of human nature, referred to existential dilemmas, joys, and tragedies in life. One of the major inscriptions scattered around the Arcadia Garden worthy of note is a dictum increase of the water reservoir at the entrance of the Arcadia Garden, which reads, "He only knows happiness who shares it with others." These inscriptions refer to the Greek myth of a poor old couple, Baucis and Philemon, who welcomed Zeus and Hermes. This motive was taken up by the Duchess and at the same time testified to her goodness and hospitality. One of the boulders of the Sibyl's grotto, a sentimental inscription was placed, or later obliterated at the end of the 9th century. "Oh, let me seek out some desolate shade, and there weep my sad bosom empty." Currently, there is no stone with this inscription in the garden. Garden inscriptions contributed in the expansion of scale of emotion, enriching and diversifying the moods that ranged from sadness and melancholy to joy and love, admiration and amazement, a sense of fear and dread. The inscriptions were to create the atmosphere of the place, encourage reflection of the cycle of life, passing and death. They opposed nature and artificiality, reality and illusion. They were to evoke variety of feelings and heart movements. Underneath the altar raised above the grotto, adorned with a marble relief representing the Holy Family, there was the following maxim: "Be immortal, that I, loved by the most beautiful, may become the bravest." At the foot of the stone arch lay a huge boulder with an inscription, "O nicer than others, Arcadian land," which I touch with my foot and I greet with my foot. The sandstone boulder with an Italian inscription in 3 lines was subjected to conservation and restoration works in 2019. Currently, it is waiting to be embedded on the right side of the stone arch. On a semicircular architrave on the eastern entrance to the Diana's temple, there was dictum drawn from the Horace's verses, "In volo altrui per ritrovar me stessa." I passed from the others to find myself. This sentence was known in Latin version, "Noste de ipsum," know yourself, attributed to a Delphic oracle. There was also a famous saying, "Habita tecum," with you I live. Through this message, Duchess wanted a moment of contemplation, reflection, and also loneliness, needed to understand herself and the world. Another sentence, this time from Petrarch, was written in Italy in the west facade of Diana's temple. In this sentence says, "After these struggles, I find my peace here." On the terrace of Diana's temple, above the stairs in front of the Island of Offerings, there is an 18th century sarcophagus with an engraved quatrain on one side and another side. Garden inscriptions containing the Arcadia Garden have been written in many languages, especially often they were written in Latin, Italian, French, English, and native Polish. Garden inscriptions were designed to simulate contemplation, evoke lofty feelings, and reach as many receptions as possible. Information about garden inscriptions is provided by visitors in the garden, travel diaries, letters, and correspondence. Many of them were described to guide to Arcadia Garden. Opposite the nightstand, on the trunk of an old tree, there was a shield nailed with an arrow with the words, "It fixed me to my destiny." From that side, a boat would leave to the Island of Offerings, on the shore of which a sphinx was set up, with a shield abated on it, and with the sentimental verses, "Go to the quiet glade amidst the shade of these trees. You will find there love, friendship, hope, and memories. You will also find a rare gratitude, and if you're sensitive, be joyful in your worries, or be joyful that you are happy." Following the river bank, you pass the aqueduct modeled on Roman aqueducts. Duchess Helena Radziwiłł, a Polish aristocrat, devoted over 40 years of her life to Arcadia Garden, shaping her own land of happiness. Outstanding architects, planners, and painters helped the Duchess in her creative concept. Over the years, the Arcadia Garden became one of the most famous Polish garden layouts at the turn of the 18th and the 19th centuries. Thanks to the description and phrase in the poem Le Jardin by Jacques Delisle, it became famous all over Europe. The High Priest Sanctuary, which is a fake ruined structure, is the most original building in Arcadia Garden. It is a symbol of destructive influence of passing time. This sphere of this ideology includes a relief adorning the northern wall of the High Priest Sanctuary, which represents hope, nourishing chimera, with the inscription, "Hope, nourishing chimera, and life's escapes." In this sphere of poetics fits undoubtedly the Duchess' idea of erecting a symbolic tomb of her own on the Poplar Island, with an Asian urn and rice housing a recumbent feminine figure sculpted in white marble with an inscription above, "Et in Arcadia ego." According to the Erwin Panofsky's interpretation, the epigraph "Et in Arcadia ego" has a dual significance, the first of which, "and I, the dead, I am in Arcadia," should be understood directly as the presence of the grave, Tu's dead, also in the Arcadian land of happiness. The another meaning, interpreted as "and I who died stayed in Arcadia," meaning the person buried here who dwelt some time in this ideal land of happiness. The Duchess clearly meant the other interpretation of the Latin epigraph, as she supplemented to the tomb she prepared for herself on the Poplar Island, with an additional phrase, "I have created Arcadia, and in it I rest." The tomb was dismantled immediately after the death of Duchess Helena Radziwiłł in May 2015, thanks to the conservation work carried out on the occasion of 70th year anniversary of the National Museum in Warsaw. The tombstone from Poplar Island returned to the Arcadia Garden after almost 200 years. The Elysian Fields were an interesting spatial motif of the open composition of the Arcadia Garden. In this open space, adjacent the garden on the side of the Łupia River, the Tomb of Illusions was created. The Tomb of Illusion was dedicated to the memory of the Duchess' 3 daughters who died one after other to the 10 years intervals. There was an inscription on the stone which created the mood of the site, "Who sows in tears reap in joy." Characteristically, a numerous sentences which constitute a literary complement of the ideological program of the Arcadia Garden describes that as a phenomenon suggestive of a note of sentimental and optimism rather than dreadful thing. Thinking of that, there is nothing terrifying, assures Duchess Helena Radziwiłł in her guidebook in Arcadia Garden. The last of known outer inscriptions placed on the shaft of the obelisk crowning the spina of Circus reads, Magnificente Augusti Helena posuit. This inscription refers to the Polish king Stanisław August Poniatowski. The garden decoration were monuments devoted to mythological Arcadia. However, not all projects were implemented. For example, the fish gate in Circus. During the times of Helena Radziwiłł, there were many inscriptions in the outdoors of the Arcadia Garden. This peculiar garden literature was supposed to be the literary mood of Arcadia Garden. All places are described in the guide. However, not many of them are survived to this day. They can be found on the western facade of Temple of Diana, the sarcophagus of Teres, the tomb of the former Poplar Island, the obelisk in Circus, the rusted stone which destination will be by the stone arch, and on them facade of High Priest Sanctuary with a chimera relief. The present shows sensitivity and shows a kind of narrative message, also shows a garden scenario and allows sharing the echo of emotions. The renovation of this inscribed stone, which will be located under the stone arch, will be make the next element of the garden decor return to its place. Thank you for your listening.
Okay, it's time now to give the floor to Marco Marcella, our recently incorporated advisor at the scientific committee. And he is also a writer and director of the magazine Jardin. And he's gonna give us the lecture Gardening in Time of War, Vita Sackville-West, Hermann Hesse, and Derek Jarman. Welcome, the floor is yours. Yes, we will. Oh, definitely, we will.
Okay, thanks. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Anna Rosa, Edina, for this invitation, for this marvelous organization. Everybody said that, but it's true. Gardening Time of War. I would like to begin with a quotation from a German poet, Friedrich Oelderling, who wrote in an elegy called Bread and Wine. He wrote this line: "What are poets for in a destitute time?" That is, in a time of anguish, of spiritual poverty, of anxiety, fear, threats. And I think we can adapt this question to our subject and say, what are gardeners for in a destitute time? Gardeners and gardens for. So this is what I would like to talk about. What is the place of gardening in a difficult situation like the one we are living? I'm not just thinking about the war that is taking place across the border, or a pandemic, or the pandemics to come. But I'm thinking in particular about, of course, the ecological situation that we have to face, and all the pessimistic predictions for the future, including predictions concerning the gardens. I was working on the proceedings of a garden conference we had in Lisbon, and in the preface, Didier Virtus, the president of the European Institute of Gardens and Landscapes, wrote something like, in 50 years, maybe there will be no gardens left. It's a possibility. It's a very, of course, negative prediction, but it's a possibility that we have to take into account. What is the meaning of, is it worth to continue, for example, planting? This is a question I'm asking myself, for example, after this terrible summer we've had, hot and dry. Well, I don't know in your countries, but in the north of France or in the north of Italy, it's been dreadful. And this is what gardeners keep talking about at the moment. All the damages caused by the drought and the heat, etc. So I'm asking this question myself about my garden in France. Should I continue? The plantation season is approaching. Shall I plant other trees? Shouldn't I concentrate on the trees and the plants that are already there, etc.? These kind of questions make us ask a bigger questions. What is the place of gardens in this kind of situation? So this is why I decided to call this little paper "Gardening in Time of War," and I think gardening history. The history of gardens and the history of literature can offer us examples or food for thought to try to answer this question. And I picked 3 gardens. The garden of Sissinghurst. I think you will hear something later, right, about this garden. So I don't have to, but you probably know it. You've probably been there yourself. Hermann Hesse, the German novelist Hermann Hesse, who had a beautiful garden in Switzerland. Beautiful, simple, but and the garden of Derek Jarman. You probably heard about it. The garden of Prospect Cottage in Kent, in the south of England. I realized that I've been too optimistic. I will never be able to talk about 3 gardens, so I will try to do my best, but probably maybe 2 gardens, that will be enough if I make it. So the first one, Sissinghurst. I won't say too much about this garden. There are amazing pictures of this place. This is the Line Walk. This is the office of Vita Sackville West in the tower. You see it, books, poetry, flowers. It's her world, etc. Well, I will finish with this quotation. So you probably know that Vita Sackville West was a novelist, but she was also a poet. In fact, she wanted to go down in history as a poet, not as a novelist. Or as a gardener. But she wrote some very interesting poems about gardens as well. That was a favorite subject for writing poetry, for poetry. There's a very interesting poem called The Land that she wrote in the 1920s about the rural landscape of Kent that she knew very well, where she lived, where she was born. And then later on, in 1931, she began another long poem called The Garden. I would like to say something about this poem in particular. She started writing it in 1939, that is a few months before the outbreak of the war, or World War II. And she finished it in 1945, at the end of the war. So war accompanied the writing of the poem, and it's always somewhere there in the background of the poem. It appears, it emerges from time to time. So gardening in time of war, it's really the subject of this poem. That is divided in 5 sections. The first one is an introduction, and then a first chapter dealing with gardening as an art, where she describes garden as agriculture's little brother, which is a very interesting definition of gardens. And then there are 4 chapters corresponding to the 4 seasons. So the poem is about gardening, the different tasks of gardeners in these 4 seasons, the plants that Vita Sackville West loved, the ones she didn't like, that she hated. Sometimes she's very unfair. For example, she hated rhododendrons or laurels for some reason, etc. But it's always extremely interesting and always very subtle. I mean, she was not only a great gardener, she was really a great poet too. So as I said, war is always there. The beginning of the poem is, the first line is, small pleasures must correct great tragedies. Therefore of gardens in the midst of war, I boldly tell. So that gives that opens, the road of reflection that she will develop little by little in the different chapters. She had a very direct experience of war, because not only because she was writing in time of war, but because her 2 sons were serving during the war in Italy and in Africa. Her husband, Harold Nicholson, you will hear something about him as well, because he's also the one who made Sissinghurst, not just Vita. You know, he was there too. Harold Nicholson lived in London, spent almost all the time in London working for the wartime government. And there are beautiful descriptions made by Vita's son, Nigel, about what happened in this garden during the war. For example, there was a German bomber crashing in flames that missed the tower of Sissinghurst by a few inches. Vita remembered walking in the garden at night with all the lights out because of the war, and looking up and watching the German bombers flying towards London, where they were going to drop the bombs. Sissinghurst was not far from the place where the German invasion was expected in 1940. So war is really the not only the background, but really the subject, gardening and war. So the question that Vita asks is, does it make sense to spend time tending a beautiful garden, a delicate flower bed, for example, a rose garden, when this is going on all around us in our own country, and in Europe? What can a flower or a flower garden do against the bombs, against violence, against barbarism? And of course, the answer is nothing. A garden cannot change the course of history, but it makes sense to garden. It is worth continuing to take care of a garden, and it is worth continuing to write a poem. It was very difficult for her to write, despite the atmosphere, the ambience that was all around her. But it was worth to continue because a garden can. First of all, I think this is more or less what she says in a very poetical way. So I'm translating a little bit what she says. A garden can oppose the time of nature, the time of cycles of birth and death and rebirth, to the time of history, to the time of man, in this particular case, time of war and destruction. So it can give strength in this sense. But especially can oppose, she says, civility to barbarism, which is a very interesting image. Garden as a place of civility, or as order and beauty, etc., to barbarism and to pessimism and to hopelessness. A garden can always proclaim life, uphold life, when everything around us speaks about death. So this is why it is important to continue, despite of everything, to cultivate the graces of life and retirement. She says in her. This is a note she wrote in the margins of the manuscript of the garden. The love of the graces of life and retirement. So a garden is a place where you can step back a little bit, step aside, and look at things from a distance, and cultivate all the values that the world, that history denies and tries to destroy. So yes, maybe I won't say too much about this garden and about what happened during the war, because we will probably hear more about this. I would just like to end this first part about Vita with this quotation. In the first part of the poem, The Garden, she gives this beautiful definition of what a garden is. That is related, of course, to the context, to the context of the war. So the question, what is a garden? She answers, a world in a lost world, a little perfect world, with owlet vision in a blinding time. An owlet is a little owl that is a night bird that can see through the dark. So this is why it is important to take care of a garden, to continue planting trees and taking care of the garden. And this is possibly the best definition that you can have of a garden, I think. One of the best, maybe the best ones, I don't know. I visited Sissinghurst many years ago, the last time, but after visiting another garden, the garden of the other garden I would like to talk about, that is also in Kent, the garden of Derek Jarman. This is I don't know, the discussion we had yesterday. What is a historical garden? Is this a historical garden? I would say yes, because it was laid out in 1986, So it's quite recent. And probably it was not a historic garden while Derek Jarman was making it, but maybe it is historic now for us because so many things have been written about it. It's such an inspiring garden for young landscape architects at the moment. It's quite recent. I mean, I've heard about this in landscape schools in France or in Italy. You know, they talk about this garden, they take it as an example. So it has become historic in a sense. Also, I'm not sure you know who Derek Jarman was. We are talking about gardening and literature. He is better known as a movie maker, as a filmmaker, a little bit as an artist as well, but he was also a writer. And to me, he's done some of the best garden writing you know, that you can find. In particular, this book that you can see here, he probably, it's been translated in Spanish probably, no? In Italian, into French. This is one of the books. This is the book he wrote, his last book, and the one he wrote about on his garden. And also, gardening is very often present in the book he wrote at the time called Chroma, a book of colors, and in the journals that he wrote, and then were published right after his death, I think. In particular, a book called Modern Nature. I don't know if it's been translated into your languages, but it's a great book, and so many passages are about the garden. You can see the garden while he's making it, and all the meaning and that the garden acquires little by little in his life. There was no war around the garden at the time. At that time, it's a different kind of war that he had to fight, the war against disease. Because when he started planting this garden in 1986, as I said, Derek Jarman had just been diagnosed HIV positive. He had AIDS, and especially at that time, there was nothing against AIDS, no cure. So he knew that he had a little time to live, a few years, and he made a garden during those years. I mean, it's a funny thing to do that. Instead of traveling around the world and see all the beauties of the world, he made his garden. Sorry. He was one of the first people to declare his illness at a time when maybe some of you remember that in the first years AIDS was covered with silence and invisibility. Nobody wanted to talk about this, so he had to fight, you know, to become visible. And as you will see, his garden played a role in this activity, in this political activity, in this sense. So he found this garden in, this is Derek Jarman, and this is the house and the garden around it. It's quite small. The house is really a tiny house. It was a fisherman's hut. He was traveling through this part of Kent called Dungeness. It's a flat land, absolutely. You know, it's quite amazing. If you've been there, you should go there. Honestly, it's one of the suggestion, because especially if you go to Sissinger's first, but it can't also because the contrast between these two gardens is so spectacular, Sissinger's and Derek Jarman's garden. But anyway, he was traveling through this part of Kent, and he saw this house on sale, and he bought it. He didn't live there, he just used it for the weekends. He continued to live in London. It's really small places. Now it's going to become like a residency for artists, I think. And he spent here, anyway, he used it for several years. He died in 1994, and during those years, Prospect Cottage, the name he gave to this house, or Prospect, as a perspective, which is amazing when you think that he didn't have any. That became really the center of his life. If he didn't live there all the time, but that became really the center of his life. It was an extremely creative period for him. I think he really wanted to use the last years that he had left to produce the more he could. So he made several films, including a film called The Garden, where you can see the place and the house, several films, books, painting, and but he says that the garden was really the center of all those things, of all his activity, of his life and his artistic activities during those years. In an interview answering a question about the diversity of what he was doing at that time, cinema, etc., he answered this: gardening is at the center. It's what I should have always have done. I shouldn't have become involved in cinema. That's for fools. Gardening is central because with gardening, one is entering another time. And I hope I will have time at the end of this, my little speech to see how you can explore time through gardening. So he started gardening, not right away, you can see him gardening here, but at first he didn't want to make a garden because Dungeness is really not the right place for a garden. You can imagine, I mean, you can see it here, for example, in this image. It's a peculiar landscape when you think about it. You can see the nuclear power plant, the power station here. And as you can see, there is no fence. This is what I should have done. Stupidly, I would have built something, a fence, to protect the garden, to avoid the view that is not exactly what we call a picturesque view. But he said he was in love with the desolation of the landscape of Dungeness. So he wanted, it's like a borrowed landscape, but in a very particular way. It's really an artist's garden, of course, as you can see. So the nuclear power station is like a church or a beautiful building in an 18th century garden. You can see it here too. And this is the landscape of Dungeness. And this is something you wrote: my garden's boundaries are the horizon, which is a beautiful image that makes us think about the inside, the outside, the relationship with the inside of the garden and the outside. But in a very poetical and almost philosophical way. But he knew he didn't have time to make a real garden, a proper garden. Really? Ah, okay. He didn't have time to, so he started by, sorry? A few minutes. So everything was against the garden. He didn't have time to make a garden. As you can see, the soil is absolutely horrible. It's just a shingle soil, pebble, shingle, sand. It's very windy. There are storms in the winter. It's very dry in the summer, no rain. But he made a garden anyway. And he started, first of all, he began by placing stones to make formal patterns around the house, circles, squares, and then he started planting little by little. He planted a dog rose, and then he continued. And as you can see in these images, as you can see in those images, for example, you can see that this garden is a real garden. I mean, a garden made by a keen gardener who knew plants. He knew what to plant. Those plants are all perfectly adapted to the soil, to the climate. Mediterranean plants, but not only hardy perennials. It's a perfect garden in a sense. I think I will have to jump to the conclusion. But anyway, yeah, there are so many things to say. I'm sorry. I could talk about this garden for days, but. For him, he writes about what gardening meant to him. And he says it clearly that for him, gardening was a therapy. He studied the use of medicinal plants. But of course, what was healing for him was touching the soil, putting a seed in the soil and watching it grow and taking care of it. And that was the healing part of gardening. And there are also beautiful passages in his writing when he speaks about this sort of solidarity or complicity that he finds with the plants of his garden. For example, he writes in his journal that on a January morning he sees a borage plant that blooms in January, so it's really too early. So and the flower droops, of course, because of the frost. But as soon as a little sunshine comes out, the flower recovers. And he writes in his journal, "I, borage, bring courage," which is apparently an English saying that comes from Latin, from the Roman soldiers used to shout, "I, borage, bring courage," because they used to drink borage wine before the battle, because borage was supposed to give courage. So this is very touching, and I think it's a good way of thinking about what a garden is for all of us, and not just for gardeners, by the way. We find all this in experience of gardening. So in those moments, Prospect Cottage becomes really a Garden of Eden. It's an image, of course, we use it all the time about gardens, the Eden, Paradise Eden. And he uses it too quite often. But I think for him, his garden could really be Eden. That is the good place, the desirable place, the place of life. A place where utopia, or an ideal world, can become real, and a material world where you can live. There is also how can I say that? Like an acceptance of death that you can find in his writing and in his gardening at that time. That is, death is a part of something bigger than the end of an individual's life. that this is a part of something bigger, the time of life that he can see at work in his garden. As I said, the birth and the death, and then the rebirth of all the cycles of nature, of seasons, of life and death, etc. So it's a way of giving meaning to death in a sense. So it's not just a consolation or solidarity, etc. But death is very often present in this. It's everywhere in this garden, and he knows it. For him, his garden is almost like a cemetery, like a graveyard. He says that, for example, when the mailman brings a letter announcing the death of one of his friends in a hospital in London or New York, he writes, he places, I think I got a few images of this. Well, this like, it's like a cross, you can see those driftwood sticks that he found on the beach. Pebbles and iron objects that he found. He used to collect them and carry them to his garden, not just to make simple decoration. It's really an artistic gesture that is related to death, of course. So the garden becomes also a memorial or a mausoleum, also for his own death that is already present in the garden even before he dies. So this is really very touching and very, very strong. He writes, for example, in a poem in the book that I showed, Derek Drummond's garden. I walk in this garden holding the hands of dead friends. Death and life are so strongly present in this garden that I can understand why it can become a model for a landscape architect who wants his garden to be something more than just a pretty place where he can walk and enjoy the beauty of nature, but something deeper and quite powerful. So. There are so many things to say about this garden, well, just as a conclusion, I think I have to finish here. It began with a quotation from Hölderlin. What are poets for in a destitute time? There is another quotation that you probably heard because it's very often mentioned. Hölderlin wrote that full of merits, but poetically, man lives on earth. We can discuss about what poetically means, I think. Maybe we've seen a few examples of what poetically living in a garden can mean. Because I think a garden, this is the lesson or the message that garden has always had, probably. This is maybe the real role of a garden is always to teach us or to remind us that we are supposed to live poetically on this land. So this is, and in a time like the one we are going through, this becomes more and more necessary. So yes, the answer, of course, to the first question, it is worth to continue planting the gardens and taking care of the gardens that are already there, and to make the history continue. Thank you very much. I'm so sorry for being so. I will continue.
Yes, so it's always tough to give a sign to continue or stop, but I think that there are always signs. How we started this section, that unfortunately Troy Scott Smith couldn't do it on behalf of Sissinghurst. You really very well updated promptly your presentation today, so thank you very much for referring also for Sissinghurst. And I think that there were, it's not my task to take the key takeaways from it, but if you let me do so, just to quote what you said on regarding the OLED vision as well during nowadays challenges, and to have the forward-looking thoughts and to have the debates like yesterday. We had a chance to get included in this sort of debates, and I hope that we can still continue with this question and answer section. At the moment, we thought of starting with the people in person present in here, and whether you have questions regarding the first section or the second one. I think that each and every participant, the lecturers, are also ready to reply your questions. So please just raise your hand, give a sign. Now it's up to you to give me a sign to finish and give the speech to you. So anyone, or who would like to start? Let's put it so. To give it a link, we could hear about some wonderful gardens in Warsaw. Also from Katarzyna, what international touches we can still see in gardens, also through various gardens that Marco Martella was talking about with regards to Sissinghurst, but also later on with Peter German, if I said it right, how it can be used later on into outdoors residences. So, sorry, it might have been my fault. So there might be some questions around, or yeah, Maria, I knew we can count on you. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I have a question for Marco and for the rest of the speakers. I mean, I think we can all also contribute on this. But it's about the garden as we think of it in the beginning. Of the beginning as an enclosed space that has the gate and has this entrance. Do you think that is the border of the garden, of that limit, as in this example, is something that is changing? So you can say it's like an evolution of the concept of the garden, not having so much a physical boundary, if that's something we can say now.
This is really a unique garden, I think. I'm not sure it's representative of what's going on at the moment. And I'm not sure about, I don't think, maybe somebody can answer, maybe Monica. Well, boundaries have been moving through garden history, when you think about it. The medieval hortus conclusus, etc. And then the borrowed landscape or even in the Renaissance in Italy. I mean, Leon Battista Alberti is probably the first one who wrote something about it, about the fact that when you lay out a garden, you have to take into account the surroundings that become a part of the garden in a sense. He doesn't say that exactly this way, but it's important because when you are in the garden, this is what you have, what you see when you're. So there's a connection between the outside and the. But that evolves through time, and at the moment, I don't know. I'm not sure that it's really something that is really particularly interesting for landscape architects. Not to have boundaries. The horizon, yeah, sure, yes, yeah. But at the same time, you know, it's really interesting. We could talk for a long time about this because if you go to Dungeness, I did it many years ago. At the time, the garden was totally unknown. Nobody knew about this place, and I was driving through Dungeness, and I didn't have the address. I didn't know where it was. I knew that there was a nuclear power station somewhere, and you can see it. But you know, it's wide and it's big. And I saw the garden from afar when I was driving. Oh, well, that's the garden. Well, it was so far because you see this patch of colors, this amazing. So the inside is much more, and the difference between the inside and the outside is even stronger there than in a garden with a wall around it, in a sense. So it's paradoxically, but it's interesting. So there is an inside. There is an inside. I mean, you know, a limit, a frontier, and. Yeah. They try, yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
no, I think it's etymologically, the term garden comes from an enclosed place. I don't think we could say it has evolved. It has, from time to time, the relation with the natural or with the environment has been changing, but I think not an evolution in a line, but more depending on the philosophical, social trend of the moment, no? The terza natura that you are speaking of, it's classical of Renaissance, and it was the continuity of the three, no? The garden, the agricultural land, and the natural, could say. So this has been, I think, throughout the history of gardens everywhere, no? But there's always a meaning, what you are saying, even if you don't have limits, you mentally have them, no? So bueno, not in Versailles where the garden was everything, no? So we could be speaking hours about this. I just wanted to point out that Marco is not only a great garden connoisseur, but he's a writer himself. He has some beautiful books that I recommend, but he writes under another name, no? So, why this, Marco?
Thank you, Monica. Thank you so much for this question. No, why? No. This is even worse than the limits of the garden. I mean, we could talk. I think we need a psychoanalyst to answer this question. Why did I do that? I don't know. It's just a game, but I think writing is a game. So, oops, sorry. So yes, it's for the fun. The original doesn't exist. The original doesn't exist, so in a sense, it should be translated into the original language. I don't know if somebody wants to do that.
On your books? So I could see some of the guests also. Albert, you have a question.
Thank you. I wanted to reflect in a few words to the question coming from Maria about the borders of the garden, and to reflect in the same time to the etymology of the word mentioned by Monica. So as I know, the origins of the gardens are in the Garden of Eden, yeah, and the Garden of Paradise. The name of paradise is coming from a Persian word. In Persian, they call the garden Paradeisos. So it means that we are talking about the garden of the paradise. And of course, probably you heard about Mircea Eliade. He was a philosopher living in Romanian origin, living in Paris. And he has a famous theory. He called that a cosmos chaos theory. And he told that the garden is the place where the mankind can feel good, safe, and can be happy. And this place is defended by a strong wall. And this wall is against the evil existing outside of the garden, where is not a harmony, not a cosmos anymore. There is the chaos, because we cannot control that. We don't know that region, and we are fighting against that power. And if we want to make a parallelism, nowadays gardeners are doing the same job actually. The Garden of Paradise was defended by two archangels, yes, Michael and Gabriel. And nowadays we took the place of the archangels, and we use not animals words, maybe we use insecticides and other kind of chemicals to defend our gardens and to keep the order we create in the garden. We don't like to see anything else, just we really plant in our gardens. And even in case of Derek German's garden, we saw that there were many nice flowers and ornamental plants. It was a kind of intention to create something else than outside of the garden, even if he didn't use a wall or a fence to do that. And I think this will be an eternal conflict. Of course, we can extend the borders of the garden, and virtually we can extend mainly linking the landscape visually into the garden, but we will need a kind of protecting wall around our gardens, at least as I see in this moment. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Albert. It's really good to hear these reflections, also launching a certain debate, like if we could hear it right, Marco Martala, when you quoted Monsieur Wirth, Didier Wirth, also saying that in 50 years there won't be any gardens. I also let you discuss it, might not necessarily now. Now it's me who have to check the time. I think we still have a little bit. And also what, Albert, you just said that, yeah, how to integrate landscape and gardens. As far as we know from the European Route of Historic Gardens, there is also an initiative of the Gardens that Vertebrate Europe. And one of the topics run by Maria Matos and also Teresa Andresen, I think this is actually the relation also in between the landscape and gardens. So I'm very curious to see this video series. So yeah, this was also a little bit of time to gather your thoughts for further questions that you might have. Anyone who would like to raise their hands? Oh, I see Monica, please. Don't be sorry, it's really good to have your ideas shared. Thank you.
So I think that it's what Marco has spoken about this gardens as places of life is very important, not only in a conceptual way, but also linking it to conservation and protection. Gardens are places for life because it's a constant renewal of nature. So, but this constant renewal of nature give to the gardens one of their characteristics, that's dynamism and evolution. And if we think of their conservation and their protection and their restoration or whatever, precisely this fact, time in the garden, makes it so difficult and so different from conservation and protection, for example, of built heritage. No, that's much easier because you don't have to take into account this constant renewal. No, so you have to manage change and manage renewal. So important things, concepts referring to gardens have a lot of influence afterwards in the practical world that you managers, most of you managers have in relation to the conservation of gardens. Was just, sorry, Sam.
remarks, questions, please don't hesitate, even though still we'll spend time together this noon and also in the afternoon. So I'm sure I still have a few questions, but I will try to pass by later on, since as we could hear as well, that gardens are for sort of well-being. I try to quote it from Albert, as you also said, where we human beings are also supposed to feel good. And we could hear that we can gather courage from multiple sort of beverages as well. So there will be some which are waiting for you outside during the lunch break as well, which is about to come, because we have advanced a little bit the program so as to seize the moment of the sunny weather. So thanks everyone for crossing your fingers for this. We managed to do it, and still hopefully it will remain in this weather for the afternoon. So first I invite everyone to enjoy this lunch break, also to exchange, because as we could hear about the life cycle of plants and also human beings through the various signs, it's also good to cultivate and change, but also to exchange thoughts and ideas and point of views. So I invite everyone to enjoy the lunch break, and there is a program point during lunch, which is a guided visit in the named Károly Garden, and we'll have it with a simultaneous translation, not me taking care of it. You hear me enough, I think, today. So I would suggest you not forget to take the earphones, which will be prepared here at this floor. So now we start the lunch break, and 12:15. So in like half an hour, we're sort of going out to the garden, and when we'll come back, you'll still have a little bit of time, but we advance the official program from 1:30 to restart to 1:10. So 1:10, we will continue it officially here. But beforehand, I suggest now to take the lunch, and at 12:15, so 12:15, we go for the walk in the Károly Garden. Okay, so see you later.
Well, this year, for the first time, we are preparing a publication with all the lectures. I take the advantage to remind all lecturers that you have to submit the content. So we will have this publication. It is very important for us as a network, as a cultural root of the Council of Europe, to start doing this type of things, this type of scientific publications. But in this specific case, in which some of you, some of the lecturers, might have not had enough time to develop all the ideas that you have, it is a perfect opportunity that when you submit the content, you add those things that maybe you didn't have time to present here, okay? Just in case, because, for instance, in your case, I know you had more things waiting, more ideas, and, well, you have the opportunity to write it down so that we can all read it. And we are also recording all the presentations, and we will, of course, upload them in our YouTube, so that you can also see it, and most importantly, because you have already listened to them, that you share them with all those people that you think they might be interested, okay? So, I finished already.
Thank you. And even though I'm quite sure that you will prefer to exchange personally, talking about reading, on behalf of the tourism destination and the Hungarian Tourism Agency, we suggest you to take this product, this marketing material, also to read it and to feuillate it, to page it, so as to have some hunger and some taste of our destination, to come back and enjoy the further attractions as well. So see you later.